Hello and welcome to the Shifting the Paradigm webinar series, where we build community knowledge, skills, confidence and understanding of child sexual exploitation. We hope that you find this webinar beneficial.
First of all, I would like to start by explaining that I am delivering this webinar from La Truita, which is down in Tasmania, which is a beautiful part of Australia. And I want to pay respects to the traditional owners of our land, the Palawa people, and thank them for taking such good care of our land and waterways down here that we get to work and play on every day. So Tasmania is a beautiful, beautiful place. And I'm acknowledging that many of you are watching this webinar from different places across Australia. So today I thought I would just start by giving you a bit of an overview of where I work and what work we actually do here at the Sexual Assault Support Service down in Tasmania. So SAS for short. Primarily the work we do is with victim survivors who have experienced any kind of sexual harm or sexual violence. And so the primary work we do is around therapeutic services and counselling. So we have a number of programs that we run here at SAS in the counselling space. We have an adults team that obviously work with the adults. We have a children and families team working with children, adolescents and their families. We also have a prison program. So we do work with people who are currently incarcerated or when they leave prison that are victim survivors of sexual abuse. And we also deliver a redress program. So we have a team that support people to make applications through the redress scheme as well. And of course, we have the PAST program, which is the one I oversee. So PAST stands for Prevention, Assessment, Support and Treatment of Harmful Sexual Behaviours. So the PAST program is delivered statewide. We actually have partnered with Mission Australia and Laurel House, another sexual assault support service in the northwest, to deliver that program across the state. So as well as that, we also have a crisis team. So the crisis team work after hours, weekends, public holidays, and they are present to respond to any victim survivors who may be in distress, who may have experienced a recent assault. They will sometimes refer through to our day service. They can also support victim survivors to have medical examinations, forensic medical examinations, and support with police reporting and things like that as well. So the other big piece of work that we do here at SAS is our primary prevention and training team. So we have a fantastic team that deliver a lot of training. A big part of our training is our consent and relationship education training, where we go out to schools from grade 3 upwards at this stage, and we deliver education to the students on consent and healthy relationships. So they do an amazing job in that space. We also deliver training to professionals around different topics like dealing with disclosures, harmful sexual behaviours, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of training that happens at SAS as well. And then we do a lot of work in the community awareness and policy space. So that's just a little bit about us so that you know where I'm coming from, what our team does and sort of our background. So today we're going to talk about harmful sexual behaviour and the intersect and sort of connection somewhat with child exploitation. So obviously there's a number of people in this webinar today. So, there could be varied knowledge. Some of you may know a lot about harmful sexual behaviour. Some of you may be quite new to the space. So just to give you a bit of an overview, harmful sexual behaviour or inappropriate problematic sexual behaviour in young people, we define it as sexual behaviour has been expressed by young people under the age of 18 that is outside the norm for their age or stage of development, outside of the norm of what we would expect for that child at that age or developmental level. So that was a quote sort of from Professor Simon Hackett, who defined harmful sexual behaviours many years ago. And harmful behaviour, the sexualised behaviour, could be towards themselves. So it may be that a young person is engaging in excessive masturbation to the point that they're harming themselves, so they need medical attention. So that would be an example of harm towards self. It may be that the harmful sexual behaviour is happening towards others. Now, the behaviour could be happening towards another child. It could be happening towards, someone their own age or a bit older, a bit younger, and it could also be happening towards or presented towards an adult as well. But it is any behaviour that's outside of the norm of what we would expect for that child given their context. So, pathways to harmful sexual behaviour. We know that harmful sexual behaviour can occur either online or as a contact, so person to person. And as I said, it could happen towards self or towards others. So I've got a list here of pathways to harmful sexual behaviour. So these are sort of things, I guess, that create vulnerability in young people that mean that they may be at higher risk of engaging in sort of problematic or harmful sexual behaviour. So this is a list that comes out of the research. There was some recent research done by Gemma McKibben. She did a scoping review, and certainly these were sort of some of the topics that came out of that review. So experiencing abuse of any kind, so neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse, or being exposed to family violence is certainly creates a higher risk. Disrupted attachment, which you would often see within those experiences of abuse. So when young people do not have a primary caregiver or a solid, secure attachment to a primary caregiver. We see inappropriate sexual boundaries, so that it might be that within the home environment, there are not great boundaries in place. So young people might be exposed to sexual content that is probably beyond their age and stage of development. So whether or not that is exposure to something online that parents or carers are watching, or whether that's exposure to behaviours the parents and carers are engaging in as well. Some of it is around emotional dysregulation. We also have a cohort that fall in sort of to the antisocial thinking. So this is around young people's attitudes and beliefs around sex, around relationships, all those sorts of things. So if people tend to have this antisocial way of thinking, which may have come from the context of family, then that can sort of be a driver in this space as well. The other thing we do see is deviant or skewed, it's not always deviant, but skewed sexual scripts. And a lot of that is created through accessing of pornography. So we know that a lot of mainstream pornography has themes of aggression in it. There can be there's rarely any consent discussed within a scene in pornography. We do have a lot of things like choking, slapping, hitting, and it's often directed towards women in that content. So if young people are watching a lot of this, if that's where they're going for their sexual education, then they can create these sort of skewed sexual scripts, and that can lead to them harming others, themselves, and making mistakes. Are certainly around the age where they're starting to become curious and explore sexual relationships with their peers. And then the other one is, which we don't see as really in our program, it's certainly not the common driver that we come across, but there can be a sexual interest in children, and that is the driver towards harmful sexual behaviour. But as I said, we don't see that a lot in our program. It sort of makes up a smaller percentage of young people. So if I'm thinking about the fact that abuse and family violence certainly make up or increase the risk of engagement in harmful sexual behaviours. We know from the Australian Child Maltreatment Study that quite a number of Australians have experienced at least one form of maltreatment. So of the study that they did for the ACMs, there was 62.2% of people had experienced at least one type of maltreatment, so neglect, physical assault, emotional abuse, exposure to family violence. So we know that that occurs much more in our society than we would like. And the other thing about harmful sexual behaviours that came out of the Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study is that adolescents actually inflict the highest proportion of child sexual abuse. So it's nearly 13% of child sexual abuse is actually happens from other adolescents. So we are seeing a lot of this peer-on-peer harm that's happening, or harmful sexual behaviours from one peer to another happening in Australia. So it is certainly something that needs addressing and that we need programs for as well. So when we're talking about harmful sexual behaviours, often when we're assessing young people, we're looking at what their needs are. Often behaviours, whether they're sexual or any other type of behaviour, is being driven by an unmet need. So we've got this diagram here with the iceberg, and as you can see, we can clearly see the harmful sexualised behaviours or the problematic sexual behaviours. And what is often underneath that is a need for connection, a need to regulate, a need to make sense of their own experiences, the need to have some level of control, those sorts of things. So when we're assessing harmful sexual behaviours, these are the things that we're trying to look for, is what is actually driving this behaviour? What is the unmet need for this young person? How can we fix that, replace that, change whatever's happening for them? So as you can see, there's a lot of feelings that come up for a young person in this space, loneliness, confusion. We know that some harmful sexual behaviour comes about because of simple curiosity, and kids might be getting things wrong. They may not have had, the greatest education around consent and relationships. They might be exposed to really poor modelling within the home, those sorts of things. So there can be confusion that happens in that space. And certainly when the behaviours are discovered, there's a lot of other emotions around shame that can come up for a young person as well. So what we're really doing is we're looking at what these unmet needs are within harmful sexual behaviour. So as an example, or actually just to go on, when we're looking at harmful sexual behaviour or problematic sexual behaviour, we're trying to assess it on a continuum. So we're really trying to understand whether this behaviour is in the normal developmentally expected range, or whether or not we're looking at something different. And this can be really tricky because there's not a lot out there to tell people, well, what's normal, what's expected, what should we developmentally expect for this 5-year-old or this 10-year-old or this 17-year-old. So it can be a really tricky space for some people to assess what they're seeing and figure out whether it's sort of safe or not. So we look at this continuum, and things can move up and down the continuum. So what we have to start with, and this is another framework that's developed by Professor Simon Hackett. So we have normal developmentally expected behaviour, it's socially acceptable, it's consensual, and there's shared decision making in that. So even if behaviour is normal and expected, it sometimes, depending on what's happened, it still requires a response. So an example, really basic example I would give is if you had some kids at preschool, so daycare age range, and they were pulling their pants down and showing each other their private parts. For, say, a 3-4-year-old, that would probably be quite developmentally expected behaviour. If no one's in distress, everyone's just happily showing each other, we would consider that fairly normal behaviour, but we would still intervene and we would still respond to explain that we actually don't pull our pants down in public, in front of other people, because what we're trying to do is socialise them to the norms of, society, and that, that's a privacy thing. So it still requires a level of intervening at that point. Then we get up to inappropriate, where there might be a one-off incident. It might be socially acceptable within a peer group, but outside of that peer group, it's not accepted at all. So it might be that the context is inappropriate. So then we have problematic, which might be more persistent behaviour. It's developmentally and socially unexpected, but it still might be a bit of a grey area around consent or victimisation and that sort of thing. So, and then very clearly we start getting up into the abusive, violent end where there's certainly a misuse of power, it's intrusive behaviour, there's no consent, those sorts of things. So we're starting to get up to that space. And then certainly with the violent end, it's physically violent and highly intrusive and that sort of thing. So that's the continuum that we kind of use to do an initial assessment. It's not a thorough assessment, but it's really just trying to give us an indication of where this behaviour sits on the continuum and therefore what we need to, the response it requires at that point. So I've just put some example case studies together. So for harmful sexual behaviour, they're very, very brief. So just to give you a really quick idea. So first of all, I've got the online example. So we've got Ben, who's a 14-year-old male. He's shared inappropriate images of himself with peers. So what this young boy did is he was walking through the school and he airdropped a whole heap of inappropriate photos of himself. And so whoever had their phone open and had the airdrop function on received those photos. So it was really unclear how many young people received the images, what the impact was for those young people at the time. So that would be an example of harmful sexual behaviour where he has taken those inappropriate photos, exposed a whole heap of other children and young people to the photos, which could have caused a lot of harm. It also could cause harm to Ben himself because he could be socially isolated for such behaviour. People may think he's a bit strange for doing it. They might reject him. So he may experience some sort of harm from that as well. So secondly, we've got the contact harmful sexual behaviour. So we've got Lucy, who's 7 years old and was found touching her friend's private parts in the toilet at school. The report she's done it once before. And the friend who she touched stated that Lucy asked if she could touch her vagina, but the young person was actually too scared to say no. Later on, when we looked at this, there were actually reports that Lucy had experienced sexual abuse by a cousin a few years prior when she was probably about 5. A similar thing had happened to her. And so, you know, we were looking at whether or not this was a bit of a trying to make sense of what happened to her and all the emotions that brings up for her. But this is sort of a very clear case of harmful sexual behaviour or problematic sexual behaviour. Probably need to clarify that. So, so this is sort of what we'd be looking at. All the case studies that I am delivering today are, I've changed names and ages and bits and pieces, but they are based on sort of referrals that we have received here at SAS. So they're around harmful sexual behaviour. Now, the other thing I probably need to mention is when I use the term harmful sexual behaviour, it's a bit of an umbrella term. So what we actually do know is that we might refer to everything as harmful sexual behaviour, but within that, it could be anywhere from inappropriate to problematic to, you know, to abusive and violent. So it sort of can range in that continuum, but we use the sort of general term as harmful sexual behaviour, just as one sort of statement. So moving on, we have child sexual exploitation. So the United Nations has put the definition as child sexual exploitation is abuse of a child where some form of remuneration is involved. So this is where the perpetrator benefits from the sexual abuse as far as it could be money, socially benefits, anything, but there's some sort of exchange and the perpetrator benefiting from this situation. So that's probably the really important part to remember in exploitation as well. And remembering that child exploitation is a form of child sexual abuse. So some people sort of pull them out, but it is one form of child sexual abuse. So just looking here, similarly to HSB, you can have online exploitation or you can have contact. So the person-to-person child sexual exploitation or CSE. And as I've said there, I've put it a heading up there around child sexual abuse because it is a form of child sexual abuse. So there's a couple of different models. that I will mention today around CSE, and a lot of these models can quite easily overlap. So peer-on-peer is where we have young people who are same age or very close in age, but there's still some sort of power imbalance that's happening in that space. It could be size difference, it could be financial difference, it could be that someone's got a disability, so there's that sort of imbalance of power, but they are of a similar age. It's involving people that are under the age of 18. It could happen, as I said, online or contact. It's where someone's bullied or sexually harmed by their peers, basically. And it could be that a peer is using forms of recruitment too, so recruiting young people into sort of more organised networks. But the peer-on-peer is definitely sort of under 18. It's more the similar age, but again, clear power differential. The boyfriend-girlfriend model is where you may have, and I'm being stereotypical, gendered stereotypes here, but you might have a situation where you have a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and there might be a lot of love bombing that happens where the boyfriend, say, buys lots of gifts for his girlfriend, new phone, new clothes, takes her out for dinner, those sorts of things. So very much that grooming process and making her feel really comfortable. This does happen the other way around, and with different genders. I'm just being stereotyping for the point, making a point. But they can be buying gifts, really sort of smothering this person with love, convincing them later on to maybe have sex with their friends or things like that. So it is a huge grooming process where they're made to feel comfortable and safe and loved, and then to be exploited later down the track. So organised exploitation and trafficking is probably the one that people hear about the most. We see that a lot in movies, where there's more an organised network that may be moving people and passing them sort of geographically around. We hear about people being moved from one country to another country for the purpose of exploitation. But we need to be aware that sort of trafficking or that moving of people can be from suburb to suburb, and that sort of thing. So we do see that locally. We see that in Australia. So it also can involve a lot of criminal exploitation as well. So often getting young people to engage in other activities like selling drugs or stealing and that sort of thing, and then it can move into more of a sexual exploitation space, or just a crossover of both. And then we have the inappropriate relationships model, which usually involves one abuser and who has sort of a lot of power over the other. So often that is definitely an adult space, and it might be power over another adult or power over a young person and child, but they've certainly got a large amount of power. The control over the young person might be physical, financial, there might be a really large age gap, and the victim themselves may think that they're in a genuine relationship or friendship with this person. So they're just some examples I've written there around the child exploitation material, live streaming, solicitation, human trafficking, that sort of thing, are just some examples of what you might see in child exploitation. If anyone here attended last month's webinar with Genevieve, she certainly talked about the coerced self-production of child sexual abuse material, where young people are actually being coerced into producing this imagery. So, which can be really tricky when police get involved and that sort of thing, when they've self-generated, but they have been often coerced to do that. And I've just put the grooming down there because a lot of this involves grooming. It could include grooming over a long period, or it might happen quite quickly. So it can look very different, but a lot of it, we think of the love bombing and the inappropriate relationships very much. There's a clear element of grooming in that space. So risks and red flags, we know similar to harmful sexual behaviour, there's a lot of vulnerabilities that can increase the likelihood of CSE. So we again know that there can be physical, emotional, sexual abuse and family violence may be in the background. We can certainly see that a lot of young people that are being exploited are isolated from peers and social networks. And there's a lot of sort of ACEs in here, the adverse childhood events, so family history of mental health, family history of drug and alcohol use, those sorts of things, family relationship breakdowns. We do see unsuitable, inappropriate accommodation. We know that young people in out-of-home care are more at risk of exploitation than other kids. And it's often in these young people's lives, there is a lack of positive relationship and protective adult. So again, they're isolated from peers. They don't have great support networks and things like that. So there are all these things that can cause vulnerability and increase that risk of exploitation. So some of the risk indicators, so these are sort of the things to, I guess, that might be red flags and things to look out for in the CSE space. So if a young person has disclosed an assault but then withdrawn the allegations, that is certainly something to take note of. Young people going missing overnight or longer, possible relationships with an older boyfriend or girlfriend or partner, and just that age difference and power difference and the control that might be happening there. Physical or emotional abuse by a controlling adult is certainly a red flag, and physical injury without understanding why that's occurred. If anyone's working certainly in residential care or places like that, is whether or not you've noticed young people leaving with adults, unknown adults in vehicles, that sort of thing, but then potentially coming back to the residential care setting with unexplained money, clothing, new phones, those sorts of things. So coming back with items that they probably can't afford themselves would certainly be a red flag. And then frequenting areas known for exploitation. So there are some spaces in every city, to be quite honest, but there are certainly some spaces down here in Hobart where we know that there's more risk, and we know that there are concerns around that context. So these are just some things to look out for. So when you're assessing a situation or a young person in their context, these are things to really take note of. So I've put in here a few case studies for us to look at. So first of all, the online child sexual exploitation. So Sam is 14 years old and he's engaged in gaming. He is sort of approached by an unknown person on the gaming. As we know, the kids can talk to all sorts of different people online. So he's approached by what he thinks is a girl his own age. They're chatting for a few days, and Sam is really enjoying the contact, feeling really heard, probably a bit disconnected from parents at this point. And so he's really enjoying this contact. And then the young person or the other person on the gaming asks for some inappropriate images of Sam and promises that they will send some images in return once he's sent them. So Sam goes ahead and sends these, and then he's bombarded with messages demanding money. And basically these people saying, or this person who turns out to be an adult, saying that if Sam does not produce these images or does not pay any money, these images will go online. So this is probably a common situation that we've heard about recently with sextortion and things like that. So it's certainly coming out as a big issue. So that's an example of online exploitation. So for contact, 15-year-old girl living with a disability, and she's also living in out-of-home care. She's been moving around placements, very unstable living situations, no safe primary caregiver, disconnected from family, so quite isolated, and certainly isolated from peers, a lot of peers. So a friend's father offers to take her in and give her a place to stay. seems to really care and want to make sure she's okay, starts buying her things like new phones, clothes, providing her with alcohol as well. So, she's thinking, okay, well, this is good. My parents probably wouldn't allow this. And then he forces her to engage in sex with friends, saying that she owes him. So certainly he's provided her with things, and then he's stated, well, now you owe me. And then he's bringing friends in. So whether or not they are paying him, whether or not he's getting some sort of social status within his networks for providing this to them, it was a bit unclear. So, but they are examples of child sexual exploitation. So here is another framework that was delivered by Professor Simon Hackett again, where we're looking at the sort of intersection of harmful sexual behaviour and CSE. So today, I guess, the focus is on how these things intersect, but there's also, as well as intersecting, sometimes there is a vulnerability that is created when harmful sexual behaviour might happen. It creates a vulnerability to CSE occurring down the track, or as well as. So Professor Hackett put this together where he sort of puts these things in a bigger picture where they share certain things like lack of choice or consent. Sometimes violence can occur in both, a level of coercion, misuse of power that can happen in both these spaces. When we're talking about the intersect, we're talking about the peer-on-peer stuff often that can happen between people the same age or a similar age. Often with harmful sexual behaviour, this is not always the case, but often there is younger children involved. There's a younger child victim within the HSB space, whereas in the child exploitation space, it's often adolescent, sort of more teenage victim. With harmful sexual behaviour, often victims are mixed gender, whereas more so we're seeing probably a lot of female relationship-based exploitation happening. This all varies too, so it's not set in stone. It can vary, but these are just the little differences between harmful sexual behaviour and child exploitation. And certainly with HSB, often it's more an individual context, like a one-on-one, whereas often with CSE, there can be some group context happening in that space as well. So how do we separate out harmful sexual behaviour and child sexual exploitation? So I think this is a really important question, because what we sometimes get at SAS are referrals for harmful sexual behaviour and a child engaging in some sort of problematic or harmful sexual behaviour. And when we actually assess the referral and triage the referral and dig a little deeper, we're actually seeing some level of exploitation happening, either in addition to harmful sexual behaviour or instead of, because someone has sort of deemed it a harmful sexual behaviour when it's not what it is. So I think it's really important to look at what the difference is and understand that they are two separate things, even though they can overlap. So it's really important to understand the elements of exchange. So that remuneration, that the fact that the perpetrator gets something in return, and that benefits them is really important. But there's this element of exchange. So that is really important to know. The other thing is to understand who actually has the power in the interaction. Sometimes we get cases that when we first look at them, the initial look at them is, oh, this person holds the power. But it's really important to get a lot of context. And that's the third point, is asking questions and understanding context, because that can shift really quickly. So sometimes we can look at a case and assume this person has all the power, but when we dig a little deeper, we understand actually they're not the ones who hold the power at all. And maybe they're the ones being exploited or coerced in that space. So these are the sort of things that we really need to understand, is that element of exchange, understanding who holds the power in the interaction, and then making sure that we ask enough questions to get some clear context in that space. So here I have put up some case studies around the intersect of child sexual exploitation and harmful sexual behaviour, but also some case studies just show the vulnerability that can happen where the risk might go up higher for CSE to occur. So first of all, we've got a 15-year-old male who's engaging in harmful sexual behaviour towards female peers, and as a result, he has actually been charged with 2 counts of rape. So obviously quite serious. If we think about the Hackett's continuum, he's certainly up the abusive end of that continuum, at least potentially violent. We haven't given enough context as to what that looked like, but certainly up in the abusive end of that continuum. So when we started working with this young person and we were in therapy, we were doing assessments, it was actually discovered that a male adult relative had been taking the young boy to hotel rooms and forcing him to observe and have sex with other adults. So we know that he has engaged in some harmful sexual behaviour himself. He's on 2 counts of rape, 2 charges of rape, which certainly is harmful sexual behaviour. There's no arguing with that. But we also now know that he is a victim, a survivor of CSE. And we don't know if these adults were paid or he was paid. We don't know what exactly was happening there, but he's certainly been exploited as a child who's been forced to engage in sexual interactions with adults. So we know that this is CSE. So whether or not the CSE has caused this vulnerability for him to then go on and harm other young people himself, so from the role modelling his experiences of trauma, that sort of thing. The next case study, we've got a young girl, 14 years old, who's putting herself on dating sites. So she's actively putting herself on dating sites. She is telling people she's 19 years old, and she's seeking connection with older males and offering sexual activity. So we would put this particular behaviour or action as harmful sexual behaviour. What we're really worried about is this young girl being harmed and putting herself in positions that are causing her harm. So we're still worried about, her well-being and her safety, but the fact that she's actively putting herself online, saying she's 19, she's not being coerced to do this at all. But we do know when we're talking about those unmet needs that this is probably around connection seeking. So not having a really strong connection with primary caregivers, feeling quite isolated, that sort of thing. So wanting to feel loved, wanting to feel connection. So what happens is she's found with an adult male in a hotel room, and he has provided her with alcohol and drugs in exchange for sex. So we know, again, that there is some harmful sexual behaviour happening, but it's certainly intersecting with the fact that she's now being exploited by adults. And we certainly know that the adults hold more power. They have more responsibility in this situation. So it's clear that she's been sexually abused and experienced that exploitation. He's providing her with drugs and alcohol as well. So another example we've got here is a young girl who's 15 years of age is asking similar age peers to share explicit photos with her. So this young girl was, as I said, asking her peers to share inappropriate images. She wanted to see inappropriate photos of them, sexualized photos of them. And she was, in fact, providing the peers with money and alcohol in exchange for these photos. So she's saying to them, I'll give you money, I'll provide you with alcohol if you provide me with these photos. So there we've got this young person who is, we would say, engaging in harmful sexual behaviour, but also exploiting her peers. So there's that crossover of where we'd say this is kind of falls into both areas. This was a really tricky one, especially for law enforcement to know what to do with, because later down the track, we found that she was providing the photos to adult males and also organising meetings between the peers and the adult males. So the adults were providing the 15-year-old with remuneration for these activities. So she's in the middle, asking her peers to provide photos, setting up meetings between these peers and adult males. So she's certainly engaged in this harmful sexual behaviour and child exploitation, but it came out that she herself was being exploited by these adults. We're not sure at this stage whether or not she had been sexually abused by these adults, but she was certainly being used for recruitment of her peers. She was certainly being exploited as far as her, the remuneration that was passing hands and that sort of thing. So we do know that she was being exploited and used to recruit. So this was really tricky for law enforcement to know what to do with the 15-year-old in that space, and whether or not they should be charged or not charged. So it gets really, really tricky with these cases. Just as a practice response, I think my biggest message to everyone all the time, and the primary prevention team here would know, is I always talk about curiosity. Curiosity equals context. If we are curious, we get more information. If we're curious, we can hold more compassion for these young people. And it means we just need to ask the questions. We need to really not jump to the conclusions of what is happening for this young person. We can't jump to conclusions around who holds the most power, what role they're playing in a situation, what may or may not have happened to them. It's really, really important for us to be curious as to why this behaviour is happening, or whether it's harmful sexual behaviour or there's some sort of overlap of exploitation, is really asking the questions to get some clarity around that. This is really important because, one, it will drive our response to that young person. It will drive the intervention needs. It will drive our reporting requirements, and what other agencies we do report to, which is all really, really important. It also helps us, I guess, do the other things around disruption. So to assess a situation, it's really important that we collaborate and share information. So I certainly know here in Tasmania that we have legislation that allows us to share information if it is in the best interest of the child and around a child safety matter. So we can share information under the Act if it's in that case. And if we're talking about young people under the age of 18 where there is either harmful sexual behaviour and or child exploitation, I would argue that that is always a child safety matter. And we always have to look at what is in the best interests of that child's wellbeing and safety. So it really opens up the fact that we can share a lot of information and collaborate with other agencies to ensure that young person's wellbeing and safety is paramount and looked after. So this is really important because often we work in silos. It might be that between government agencies and non-government, there's this thing about, we can't share information. But if we're really getting down to the crux of this child's safety and wellbeing, we can. So that is a really important thing to do, because it also means that one agency might hold some information that another agency doesn't have, but it's really important for both those agencies to know the bigger picture, again, for a proper therapeutic response, for proper reporting, all those sorts of things. Under there, I've got disruption. It's really important for us to disrupt, whether it's harmful sexual behaviour or CSE. It's really important that we disrupt this behavioural context. And this is going to look really different depending on what role you hold. So I have no idea, the people listening to this webinar, what roles they have. Some may be therapeutic, some may be case management, some may be police, some may be teachers. It's unclear, but we all have a bit of a role we can play in the disruption space. So certainly in a therapeutic space where we work, we can start educating a young person on power differences and things like that. So they will start to consider, what power they have in a situation. So that can kind of disrupt this person's thinking. So that's just one example, but we really can disrupt that connection somehow. Of course, we need to tread really carefully, because if they've got a really strong connection with someone who has been exploiting them and has groomed them, then we do need to tread really carefully about how we word things and that sort of thing. It's a lot of building trust with this young person, so that when we sort of talk to them about those things, they'll take them on board. But that is a form of disrupting. and disrupting this connection and this, relationship, for a better word. And so there are other, obviously child safety services and police have more formal disruption abilities around their statutory powers. So we all can play a bit of a disruption role, whether it's reporting to other agencies. So it might be that a teacher doesn't feel like they can do much directly around disruption, but it might be that they're reporting to child safety or police or whoever, adds to the story and means disruption can happen, by those agencies. So really important to think about how can I intervene, how can I disrupt, but based on my role and what's within my scope. So management and intervention is really looking at, well, how can I help manage this situation or intervene? So whether it's a young person doesn't have stable accommodation, am I in a role where I can assist them to find accommodation so that they've got more stability? Is it that I can make a referral to somewhere like the PASS program for harmful sexual behaviours? Those sorts of things. So this is really about how we help manage this young person and intervene that fits into that sort of safety and wellbeing space. Documentation, this is really, really crucial to do. I know I went and spoke to some residential care workers a couple of years ago, and they had a young person who was, as we talked about in those red flags, was being picked up by an unknown male in a car they weren't familiar with, and then they'd be dropped home and they were, coming back with gifts. So I really pushed upon them to note down the description of the car, number plates if they could, a description of the male that was picking them up, what time they left, what time they came back, what they came back with, those sorts of things, because all that information can be really crucial if a police investigation has to happen, or we want to look at how we can disrupt behaviours and things like that. But again, this is a child safety matter when we're talking about kids who are under the age of 18. So documentation is really, really important. And sometimes you can get together with other agencies in, care team meetings or consultation meetings, and that sharing of information can start putting together really clear pictures of where this person might be transported to, what might be happening in that space. So documentation is really, really important. And of course, reporting any of those, that information to the appropriate authorities who might be able to intervene. The other thing that's really important to do in this space is around supervision and professional learning. So reflecting on cases that have come through your service or that you've come across maybe in a school setting, and working with peers in that space to reflect on how that was handled. When we had that case that was around harmful sexual behaviour or CSE, how did we respond? What was our documentation like? Were we able to disrupt in that space? Because often people think there's nothing they can do. But reflection and learning on how we can intervene, can we manage, what role do we have in this space, so that when a case like that comes through again, there's more of a clear plan around how to respond appropriately. So whether you do that through sort of clinical supervision, as I said, whether you have a care team situation, it's really important to take learnings and really look at how you might do something different next time. The last thing, and I've highlighted it, is to be really mindful around victim blaming. What happens is often we judge our young people's behaviours as we would judge adult behaviours. And that's really, really problematic, because we have young people who's are still in that sort of self-development, that, figuring out their identity, brain development still occurring and things like that. And we often are working with kids who have significant trauma backgrounds, whether it's exposure to family violence, neglect, physical abuse. They often do come through our service, and the large amount of them will have some sort of trauma background. So what we want to do is stay away from the victim blaming, stay away from putting the responsibility on the young person around what's happened, and really looking into the unmet need. What does that look like? What is driving these behaviours? How can we support them? How can we build up their capacity in life and get them engaged in more pro-social activities, get them more connected with family or some sort of safe adult. But we need to really steer clear of victim blaming, because what we see is when one service gets into a space of victim blaming, labeling the young person as challenging or problematic, then that goes on to the next agency and the next agency, and then next thing you know, that this young person gets no support, or there's compassion fatigue. People are just like, oh, I have no compassion for this young person. They're putting themselves in this position. So if you think about the 14-year-old who was putting herself online as 19 and asking to meet up with adult males, there's certain agencies that held very little compassion for her because they were like, oh, well, she's doing it to herself. But the question is, why is she doing it? Why is a 14-year-old at all wanting to meet up with adult males? Why is she doing that? So it is really, really important to steer clear of that victim blaming. Also, watching our language. There's another young person who, when she was in out-of-home care, they referred to her as, and she was 13, oh, she's engaging in sex work. And I really had to challenge that and say, well, 13-year-olds can't engage in sex work. So they're being exploited, so we've really got to watch our language around that too, that we're not using a language that, creates this victim blaming scenario. So just in conclusion, just curiosity is super important to get our context, which again will help us understand the drivers, understand what's going on for this young person, and that helps us disrupt, it helps us intervene in the most appropriate way, and it helps us reflect and learn on what's going on and how we can best respond to this young person.
Thank you for attending this webinar. Please feel free to share our resources and let us know if you have any feedback. If you would like to learn more about our program, visit projectparadigm.com.au and be sure to tune in to the next webinar.